Okay, then
Are we connecting someone to dial?
No, basically it's just us. They're all connected, but they're on mute.
Oh, I see. Right.
So they can hear us, but we don't see them.
Great. Is it someone?
Yeah, someone back over the phone.
Okay, so they can have the right signals. Listen, welcome everyone. Thanks very much for coming, and those of you joining us online, do feel free to be. I know that the surroundings are sometimes intimidating, but don't be intimidated. If you want to grab a snack or coffee or something like that, do pop out and get something. Listen, thanks for coming. We are doing a sort of series of events like this. And we did some kind of with more traditional industry earlier in the year or towards last year.
June 2021.
Wow, time. Okay, that's COVID time. Just to talk a bit to you about our RaceToZero campaign, which fits into very much with the UK's chairmanship of the COP26, which, as you all probably know, is the climate conference in Glasgow, which delivered the Glasgow Agreement. Again, part of that obviously was also obviously about the intergovernmental process, which of course is about governments committing to targets and pushing governments to commit to more and more ambitious targets. And you saw all the drama around us trying to deliver a more ambitious agenda with that respect. But there's another whole part of it, which is that you, as the private sector yourselves, can make a huge impact on this agenda, and you don't need governments. And you know, the best examples of that are, without making comment on the previous US administration, you know, certain states within the US were completely leaders in many of the climate in many parts of the US, reaching with some really ambitious climate targets as part of the Paris Agreement, which was the previous agreement to the Glasgow one. And they were doing that basically at the impetus of private sector, because a lot of the private sector believed that you know, this is the future and this is the sort of future investment. And I know many of you, I don't need to tell you, many of you that, because you know, are entrepreneurs and startups and scale-ups very much in that space. So we have here with us, of course, a colleague from the Ministry of Environment, Yuval, who I'm going to hand over to in a second, who is going to talk about Israel's commitment to this, and of course, one of the bigger delegations at COP26, and a real kind of under this government really leading into this agenda, and so for whose sort of solidarity on this, we are very grateful. And of course, our team from PLANETech, who we've been working with for some time, and really glad to have you here. So really what you're going to hear about today is really the why this makes business sense. There's lots of kind of facts and figures around this, and I'm going to leave those to the experts. I think that I wanted to highlight one personal observation I've had from kind of like dealing with and meeting lots of the startup community in Israel, etc., which is that I think you are probably some of the ones of the startup kind of industries who are most convinced and already kind of sold to some extent on this agenda. I think you've also got a job as well with some of your colleagues in the community who are not in the zero carbon space and not doing technologies related to green growth. Because I think the speed and scale at which so many of the startups and so many of the businesses are growing in Israel, which is obviously fantastic and brilliant, means that they are not necessarily thinking about their corporate affairs agenda and kind of nice to have, what they considered nice to haves, like having a net zero agenda and having corporate social responsibility initiatives of lots of different varieties. And so I think in all of the kind of networking and socializing and things that we will do with the startup community, I think it's super important that those of us who do sort of understand and get this agenda and understand its impact and the transformative effect it will have on the future and the disruptive impact it will have on kind of the economy and technologies going forward, that we sort of make them aware of it. Because I think, you know, in putting together this event, it became quite clear to us that there are quite a few very big names in this ecosystem who haven't even thought of it for 1 second. So I think that that's equally as important as many of you kind of being on board with the agenda is, I think, sort of talking about what more we can do to sort of raise its profile as things that companies have to consider as part of their intrinsic being, rather than because it's a nice to have corporate social responsibility type thing. Anyway, with that, that's all I wanted to say. The experts will go through more of it, but Yuval, I'd like to hand over to you.
Yes, thank you, Mark, and good morning to everyone. And I want to thank the British Embassy to hosting us here today in this very important and special seminar. I did my second degree at the UK, so I feel a little at home in this atmosphere. So thank you again. And I want also to acknowledge the role that the UK is taking in the recent years, and maybe before that even, on the issue of climate change. I think it was clear at COP26 that the UK did a lot of work internally, but also internationally, in bringing our world into the recognition of the importance of the climate crisis. And we should acknowledge that. And as an Israeli representative of the government, I want to thank the UK government for this. In COP26, the countries more or less agreed on a target of a net zero emissions by 2050. And in order to do that, we need to invent a lot of technologies, and a lot of ideas need to be put in place. One quote from I think John Kerry or Joe Biden, I'm not sure who said it, but he mentioned that 50% of the technologies, in order to achieve the net zero target, were not invented yet. So there is a lot of room for entrepreneurship, and for this, the startup community, the one in Israel, but also abroad, is highly important and in place. I want also to mention another initiative that is really relevant to especially investors into startups, and I'm sure many of you are in contact with investors. And in COP26, Mark Carney, who was the former governor, among others, of the Bank of Israel, presented a financial initiative, the Net Zero Alliance of the Financial Sector, mobilizing $130 trillion that will be invested only in technologies and companies that are in line with the Net Zero initiative. So the way we see it at the Ministry of Environment is that companies that won't be in line with these targets will find it quite hard to attract investments in this world. So there is another reason for doing that. But there is also other good opportunities. The recent Roland Berger report that the German government asked to do found that 4.6 trillion euros are today invested in climate tech and clean tech companies, and this grows 7.5% each year, and by 2030 it will double. So there is a lot of, it's a big market also. It's not only something that companies will have to adapt to, but there's also a lot of potential. And here Israel in the past few years did a lot in terms of investing in innovation. And today in Israel, in a recent report that the Israeli Innovation Authority, together with PLANETech, they found that today in Israel there are 1,200 companies that are working in the ClimateTech area, and 600 of them are startups. So, and this is growing. And in the past 3 years, our ministry, together with the Innovation Authority, invested 30 million shekels in startups in the area to demonstrate their technologies. 30 startups, 30 million shekels, and we're continuing investing in this area. We're also going to launch this year the Desert Tech initiative that will see how we can harness the opportunities both from the innovation side of Israel, but also being the fact that we are a semi-arid area and find solutions to fit them. So to summarize, I think there is a lot of opportunities to startups in their various stages. And I think that startups that will have a dual purpose, that both want to make sure that they're giving their shareholders a benefit, but also a benefit to the world, will probably succeed better than others. So again, thank you, and have a fruitful discussion today.
Thank you, everyone. Maybe I'll just briefly introduce myself. First of all, I'd like to thank you for coming. My name is Hadar Huberman, and I lead the clean growth sector in the UK Israel Tech Hub team, which organized this event today together with the PLANETech, with the Ministry of Environmental Protection. I focus on 4 main sectors: agri-food, energy, smart mobility, smart industry. But in addition to that, I work alongside the embassy in a climate group, climate designated group, that we had a lot of work with the Israeli ecosystem on pushing COP26 here in Israel, but also continue taking this onwards in the world post COP26, because there is a world after it. So this is definitely part of our agenda to engage with the Israeli tech ecosystem, but not just the tech ecosystem, and encourage them to think about climate impact, carbon footprint, and net zero. Without further ado, I'd like to let Uriel Claard from PLANETech to give a short presentation about the Israeli climate innovation.
Great, thank you. Remain seated if everybody can see me. Thank you, the embassy, and thank you, the ministry, for partnering in this event, and generally for everything that you do. Just to kick off about COP26, the Minister of Trade was here a week ago, and I told her that the COP26 was not was actually a successful conference, and the reason is that it made so many people interested in climate in Israel and outside of Israel. So we can say many things about it, but in the end, it made things happen, and especially in the private market. So thank you for inviting me, and thank you also for the bright entrepreneurs that are here. I think that's a great example for the variety of sectors and topics that are in the climate space. So that's not just one sector or the other, but that's like a huge spectrum. So PLANETech, brief introduction about what we do, and then we'll jump into the ClimateTech ecosystem in Israel. So PLANETech is a non-profit innovation community for climate change technologies. We are a joint venture of the Israel Innovation Institute, which is a non-profit organization that promotes innovation communities for over a decade, with different hubs in different areas. And Consensus Business Group, which is a UK-based investment group that invested already almost $1 billion in Israeli startups and funds. We are a team of 5. Tamar over here is a PhD in climate sciences, and she's leading many of our activities that we're pushing, including the report. She was actually the one that brought most of it. And our job basically is to take the Israeli innovation ecosystem and the tech entrepreneurs and investors to work around climate change, not just because that's the most important thing that we see in front of us, also because of the major business opportunity. And just reminding COP26, so we had a great collaboration with the ministry and the UK Embassy in COP26, where we led together the Israeli Climate Innovation Summit, including governmental organizations, but also some startups. So the startup here, Tomorrow.io, that participated in the event, and actually for the first time presented what do we have here in Israel as a climate innovation nation, potentially. Maybe not yet. It was also including a face-to-face event with the ambassador and other relevant people. But I do want to jump into the actual things that are happening on the ground globally before we speak about Israel. So it's clear that climate tech is not only a buzzword, and that's in the minds and actual processes of the leading key opinion leaders in the world and corporates and government. So it's not just greenwash type of sentence that you put inside everything that you say. It's actually the future that people see for the tech ecosystem globally. Speaking about the next 1,000 unicorns, speaking about how enormous companies like that starts as a startup can become Amazon or Google type of companies. That's the future that people are seeing. And again, climate tech does not describe one sector, it describes a variety of areas. And investments in these areas are growing globally each and every year. A recent report by PwC demonstrated $87.5 billion investments in climate tech, which, I don't want to give just numbers. That's a huge growth. It's more than any other VC area, and there's a good reason for that. All of the net zero pledges of corporates and governments that we're discussing today are forcing them to embrace innovation and invest money in it. And there's no way back. They're already committed, so they need to make something happen. So that's what we're seeing and reflected here in the tech ecosystem. Now, in PLANETech, what we wanted to do is to explain for ourselves and then for the external world what is climate tech. What are the different areas that can be you can find innovation in? So we've built the climate challenge map, which describes 20 specific challenges in 4 different challenge areas. So I'll briefly go over them just to give an introduction of what was the methodology for looking at the Israeli tech ecosystem. So the first pillar is the built environment, including both the infrastructure and the buildings themselves, where we live, and that's energy, mobility, water, buildings, etc. The second pillar is materials and manufacturing. It includes the circular economy, materials, manufacturing, also transparent and agile supply chains and carbon capture. The third pillar is about land use, and that's including both the agriculture sector, the soil itself, alternative proteins, and food loss and waste. And lastly, and usually neglected when speaking about climate innovation, is the natural environment. And here we're not only looking at forests and oceans and other environmental areas, but also extreme weather events, biodiversity, and Earth observations, where we see a lot of potential innovation in Israel, and it's an area of focus for PLANETech. Just as a side note, we just launched a competition around extreme weather events, where we'll find the best startups that are help to predict and better manage this type of events in Israel and globally. And with this basis of methodology, we came to map the Israeli climate tech ecosystem together with the Israel Innovation Authority. And what we found is what was quite surprising for us. We found 1,200 companies that are addressing climate challenge at least one, and over 600 startups. And the reason that this is surprising is that this is compared to other hubs, including London, which is like an enormous climate tech hub. That's a very nice number. It puts us on the map as a decent hub for climate tech that actually has something to sell. Before this report, when somebody spoke about climate innovation in Israel, they didn't have any numbers to present, and that was the first time that we actually had numbers, and we could describe, and as you can see here, based on the 20 challenges, which areas has more startups and companies and which has less, and what are the dynamics between mature companies and early stage companies. And as you can see, there's like the four most dominant areas are including climate smart agriculture, clean energy systems, sustainable mobility and transport, and eco-efficient water infrastructure. Just after that, the alternative proteins area, which is growing dramatically. Now, that was the first part. We scanned the entire tech ecosystem, we found the companies, we marked them, that was great. We wanted also to look at the investments in the companies in the different areas. So we've mapped them according to the total amount of investments and the percentage of young companies to see what are the dynamics. And this, let us know the different clusters inside the tech ecosystem, the more established fields that still need some addressing and not that, established in Israel, not established globally, those who are in rapid growth and those who are in early emergence. And I think this map that you see here already changed from October, where we published the report, to now. Red Milk raised $120 million. That's pushed the alternative proteins to the right. Future Meat raised, actually, this amount that you see here is almost doubled of the Future Meat funding rate. So things have changed. Scaleup have raised $8 million. Things have changed to good, and actually, they've changed very fast. So at the end of the year, where we decided to close the year and see what we've understood that there's a record in funding in Israeli PLANETech reaching $2.2 billion. That's higher than the previous year, which was $1.4 billion. And that's, again, comparing to other hubs globally, that's a high number, okay? Looking at the $87.5 billion, there's a lot that invested in San Francisco, a lot in investments in Europe, different hubs. But Israel as a hub by itself is quite big already. There's already an ecosystem that functions. Although, and we'll get to the although and the buts in a second, although all of the gaps that we still have. Just to mention that in the first week of 2022, there was 4 new rounds, including Scaleup, H2 Pro, Tipa, and Remilk, that got another $340 million to the beginning of the year. So the wave is amazing. And when I said COP26 was a successful conference, these things were not directly correlated to COP, right? But things have changed, milestones have changed because of COP26. In the government, where everybody now wants to be part of COP27, and when Adar and myself spoke about COP26, nobody knew about it on March, April. So things have changed to good. Just speaking about the gaps that we still see exist. There's gaps that are related to knowledge, which are enormous. Most of the startups in this ecosystem do not understand what is climate change, how to communicate it, how to make money out of it. It's still in early stages. Comparing to the UK, we are far behind, 5, 6, 7 years behind. So that's a bad thing. We can improve this. This event and seminar is an important occasion to change things. And then some other things that are still missing, including ways to scale up startups, external funding, dedicated climate funds. Hopefully we'll see some of these evolve this year in Israel, outside of Israel, coming to invest in Israeli startups. But mainly the notion that climate tech is not just, again, a buzzword, it's here to stay. It's here to stay because of the extreme weather events that we're experiencing every day around the world. It's here to stay because of the commitment for the next 20, 30 years, and because of the key opinion leaders that are pushing it. So just to sum up, it's great that we're doing this today. I think that if we see more Israeli companies taking steps and actually commit to reduce their emissions or getting to net zero, that would be amazing. At the moment in Israel, we have one company that did it, which is UBQ Materials. That's a startup. And I think this is, all of the corporates are not there. This gives us a reflection of what potentially can happen. I know that other firms are looking at it, and that's something that they potentially will address soon. So I think that startups here can have a dominant role in leading Israeli as a whole, both on the governmental side, but also take some investors and corporates in Israel to act accordingly. And it's great that the UK Embassy continues to lead this in Israel. I think that your role from now on after COP26 will continue to be significant, also with looking at COP27. Yeah, if anybody wants to learn more about what we do or work with us. That's our information, and we're available, and happy to stay in touch with all of our activities. And let's enjoy now the really great content that we're going to hear. So that's it from my side.
Excellent. So now to the actual content piece of today. We're going to speak to an organization called TechZero. It's a consortium of some of the largest British tech companies together with a governmental institution called Tech Nation that came together only 1 year ago saying we need to start pushing the tech ecosystem in the UK towards net zero, towards putting commitments, and through TechZero, companies actually commit to net zero and automatically get signed up to RaceToZero campaign. Sophia is going to represent TechZero, and she's going to give us the opening. What is RaceToZero? What is setting net zero targets, and what TechZero does?
Brilliant. Hello. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Hadar. So as Hadar mentioned, I'm Sophia, and thank you so much for having me here today. It's very exciting talking to you all. I am the lead at TechZero, and we are a group of over 244 companies of all sizes that are committed to reaching net zero. So for the next 20 minutes or so, I'll give you an introduction to the RaceToZero and TechZero, talk through what net zero actually means, and then we'll have a little break. And then after that, I'll invite some of the TechZero members to speak to you and share their stories. So, and then of course, we'll have time for questions. So the RaceToZero. The RaceToZero, as you probably know by now, is the UN-backed global campaign that rallies companies, cities, financial and educational institutions to take rigorous and immediate action to halve global emissions by 2030 and create a fairer, healthier, net zero carbon world by 2050. And together, they form the largest growing alliance of non-state actors committed to climate action. So these are some of the big players, the ones you've heard of, UBQ as mentioned there. Cities and educational institutions can also join the race, as I mentioned, and Tel Aviv and Haifa have joined the race through the city's RaceToZero. But this slide isn't to say that only big corporations can pledge to reach net zero. There are thousands of startups and scale-ups already committed. In fact, in TechZero, 35% of our members are micro businesses, so those with fewer than 10 employees. And then another 34% are small businesses, so those between 10 and 50 employees. So when you commit to the RaceToZero, what you're committing to is the minimum criteria, which are represented by these 4 Ps. So you pledge at the head of organization level to reach net zero as soon as possible by 2050 at the latest. And you also pledge to set short-term targets to achieve in the next decade. So as I said, namely halving your emissions by 2030. Within 12 months of joining, you have a plan in place explaining what actions you'll take towards achieving your short and long-term targets. And you proceed to take immediate action towards achieving net zero, and then you publish, so by publishing your report and your progress annually. So who are we? TechZero is an official partner to the UN RaceToZero, meaning any business that signs up to TechZero also joins the race. And it also means that our guidance and commitments that we ask our companies to sign up to align with the UN RaceToZero. There are several partner organizations who are part of the UN RaceToZero, some with similar pledges to ours, but what sets us apart, and the reason I'm talking to you all today, is that TechZero is specifically for tech companies, meaning we can focus on the sustainability challenges that are specific to the tech industry, because companies in the same industry are likely to face the same challenges. So we want to bring them all together to work together to make progress faster. So when a business joins TechZero, they sign up to these ambitious but achievable climate commitments that are aligned to the 4 Ps that I showed earlier. So they pledge to annually measure their emissions, have an action plan within a year of joining, and publish their emissions and progress annually. And that's pretty much it. So we really emphasize also communicating your targets, because it not only increases accountability and transparency, but it also sends the message to the wider industry, global governments, that this is what businesses are doing, this is the direction we're heading, and they better keep up. But really, more than a set of commitments, we are a community. So we really urge collaboration, sharing information, successes, failures, anything that will help us reach net zero faster. And that's why I've invited some of our members along today who'll tell their stories, and we'll hear from them a bit later. But these are just a few of the testimonials, if you will, from TechZero members. So not only have we enabled businesses to get a handle on their carbon emissions and how they can reduce them, some companies have changed their business model entirely to become sustainability focused. So for example, I spoke to one CEO who had no idea what net zero was before joining TechZero. They started out as just a hotel booking service for businesses, and now they specifically help businesses book hotels with the lowest carbon footprint. So we heard a bit from Uriel, thank you, about why companies should aim for net zero, the investment that's going into this. But I just wanted to kind of re-emphasize what companies can get from joining something like the UN RaceToZero. So companies are already being rewarded for climate action. There have been several studies and surveys showing that socially and environmentally responsible companies have higher returns compared to those who don't have clear values. And one of the reasons, or some of the reasons for this, is that those businesses attract and retain both talent and customers. So these are some stats from a CARPI report from later last year. 87% of customers have a more positive image of a company that supports social and environmental issues. 88% will be more loyal to a company that supports these issues. And this goes for both customers and staff, particularly millennials and Gen Z. These are the generations who are more likely to look for jobs with purpose. 87% would buy a product with social and environmental benefit if given the chance, and 92% would be more likely to trust a company that supports social and environmental issues. But honestly, all areas of a business can benefit, because say, for example, a key part of reaching net zero is identifying and removing inefficiencies. Inefficiencies are the things that cause waste. Waste is likely to signal loss of money. So increasing a business's efficiency, whether it's in operations, energy, water usage, it's likely to save money, and money that you can use to then take your business to the next level. And as you've heard, you'll stay ahead of what's coming, really, regulation, governments and standard bodies, businesses, and it's much easier to stay ahead of them and implement changes now rather than scramble to realign with legislation later on. So that is the what and the why, but something that all of our businesses say was, well, the main knowledge gap is what exactly is this thing we're all aiming for. So I thought I'd just take the time to kind of fill that gap, and hopefully you'll walk away from this with a really solid understanding of what net zero is and why the UN RaceToZero exists. So net zero is a state where greenhouse gas emissions are balanced by their removal, meaning an organization's activities result in no net impact on the climate. So practically for organizations, this means reducing your greenhouse gas emissions as far as possible, so by 90 to 95%, and compensate any remaining hard to decarbonize emissions using certified long-term carbon removal credits. So this is what it might look like. You reduce your emissions year on year, ideally offsetting as you go. That's represented by that gray portion there. You introduce carbon removals, the little purple bars, and gradually increase these until you reach a point where you can't reduce your emissions any further, but they're completely balanced by their removals. And it's Important to note here that by carbon removals, we literally mean taking carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it for a long time. And this is through technologies such as direct air capture and storage, biochar, and mineralization. And I might touch on those a bit later as well. But also a quick note on what we mean when we say carbon footprint. Though it has carbon in the name, a carbon footprint is the total greenhouse gases emitted directly or indirectly by almost everything that we do. So when we say carbon, we're really using it as a shorthand for carbon dioxide equivalence, which is the metric used to measure greenhouse gases' contribution to global heating and their effects on the atmosphere. So I understand this is like a lot of information dumped at you at once. So before I plow on with how we go through the process of net zero, are there any questions from the room? See on the little screen. Great, okay, I'll just go on ahead. So of course there'll be questions later on as well. So there are 3 basic steps for net zero. That's measure, reduce, and remove. Pretty simple. You can't manage what you don't measure, as I'm sure all you know. It's the same in almost every business aspect. So we ask that you measure your emissions. You can use a free emissions calculator tool. There are loads of them online. I think you were introduced to GoCardless's greenhouse gas emissions calculator just ahead of this session. And you can use those to get a general idea of your emissions footprint over the last year. To form a really robust action plan, you do of course need to go into detail, but basic measurement tools can help direct early action by revealing where some easy wins might be, where you can take easy action. And so we recommend, but by no means force, allocating a budget to work to help you work with experts such as Scaleup to help you measure your carbon footprint. If you don't have a budget for this, a great rule of thumb is to look at your accounting spend, as that will roughly map your biggest sources of carbon emissions. But on a basic level, it is quite simple to get a general overview of your carbon footprint. All you need to do, look at the activities that you need to run your business, put a figure on each of them. A lot of carbon measurement is just an exercise in data collection, as I'm sure our members will tell you. And then you calculate the emissions by multiplying these values by emissions factors, which can be found online and which will be included in some of the resources after today's session. From that, you get a total carbon footprint and how each business activity contributes. And it's really important here to say that what's important is to not let perfect be the enemy of the good. It's more important to start somewhere with the commitment of improving over time. So when you can't get real data, it's fine to use a best guess or industry averages and just knowing that you'll improve it the next time round. This was just a little quote which I really liked from a workshop that we did last year. So carbon calculating like you and improve it over time. And when it comes to measuring, you'll hear a lot of jargon. One thing that you'll need to have your head around is the different scopes. So just as you break big tasks down into smaller tasks, so you can break down your footprint into 3 smaller footprints. Scope 1 and 2 are the emissions directly within your control, such as your fleet of vehicles or the electricity you purchase from your office. Scope 3 is all other upstream and downstream emissions, your supply chain and employees working from home. Any credible net zero plan must account for scope 3, as purchasing decisions in your value chain have a really big impact on the planet, which you'll see in just a second. And this is what it would look like in practice. I would recommend taking a look at Pawprint's carbon report to see how they've measured and presented their carbon footprint. It lays it out really clearly, has a lot of detail. So here they've got all the business activities and then broken it down into which scope they fall under. And then they get this. And so they see that scope 3 is the largest source of emissions, as it will be for most companies. I think most of our members say that scope 3 accounts for 90, sometimes more, 90% of all their emissions. So here they'd be able to really focus their efforts on reducing their scope 3. So number 2, and I've been a bit sneaky and I've given you 2 for the price of 1 here. And that's because whilst reduction, especially short-term reduction, is the most important part of the whole thing, in order to reduce your emissions effectively, you need a target to aim for, obviously. So your target shows how much you need to reduce your emissions by each year. And what makes it science-based is that it's in line with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. It is really important to include short-term targets, as I mentioned, as these targets show that you're serious about climate change, or climate action, I should say, right now, rather than kicking the can down the road, seeing net zero as something to be tackled later on. But more importantly for businesses, having those short-term targets really helps you embed sustainability into your business strategy. And again, this is what it might look like in practice. So PawPrint has calculated their emissions. They've set a science-based target for 2050, but then they've broken it down into 5-year intervals, which shows that they need to reduce their emissions on average 30% per year. And they've gone into even more detail here, breaking it down into different targets for each scope and every 5 years. But I guess what you're probably all thinking is, how do you reach these targets? That's probably the most important thing. How do you choose where to start when it comes to reducing emissions? Your measurements, as I said, should reveal your biggest sources of carbon emissions, and we've found that they're likely to fall into 5 key areas: energy, what your business is run on; supply chain, how you engage with your suppliers, both upstream and downstream; travel, how you do it, and what policies are in place to make sure that it's sustainable; employees, how you can engage them to minimize their home and office working footprint; and customers, how they use your products and services. The good news is that depending on your company's size and business model, it is possible to make big reductions pretty quickly. One of our members, Supercritical, who specialize in carbon accounting from software, found that most of their customers can reduce their emissions by up to 25% with a few big changes. And I even heard of one small company who were able to cut their emissions in half simply by switching how their data was stored. So it is possible to make big savings pretty quickly. But of course, all businesses and teams are unique. There's no one-size-fits-all plan for how to reduce your emissions. But once you've identified these areas, like everything in business, it's a matter of prioritizing possible actions and planning their deployment. We'll go into a bit more detail about reduction, how other companies have done it in the next session. We'll maybe have a little break before that. But there's one more element to this, and then I promise I'll stop talking. You can go and get a coffee or something. So the priority in the net zero plan is to reduce, as I said, but as you do so, you should remove carbon to compensate for what can't. So remember, this means literally taking carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it for a long time. The reason why I keep emphasizing this is that most forms of carbon offsetting that you might be familiar with are not carbon removal. The most common and cheapest offsetting projects are what's known as avoided emissions projects, projects where you pay someone else not to emit a ton of CO2. These projects are things like clean cook stoves, renewable energy, or ecosystem protection. The problem here is if your company emits a ton and you pay someone else to not emit a ton, your ton of carbon dioxide is still out there warming the planet. And climate science demands that we must reduce emissions and take CO2 out of the atmosphere. Tree planting, which is another really popular form of offsetting, is carbon removal. That's the good news, but it is short term due to they can burn down, deforestation, uncertain lifespan. Also increasingly seeing problems resulting from planting monocultures, so just planting one of the same tree, which is destroying ecosystems, and disputes around land availability and custodianship, things like that. The most long-term carbon removal involves these nascent technologies, which I mentioned before, and these really require investment in order for them to scale. And this is happening. As you've seen, there's a lot of money going into this right now, though we'd love, of course, to see it move faster, have more companies invest in this kind of technology, with the hope that these will scale the way solar did. So the cost of solar fell something like 82% in the last decade, and we're hoping that the same will go for carbon removal. So to go back to this slide, we're not saying that avoided emissions offsets are a bad idea or not to do them, not at all. They are a great thing to do while you reduce your emissions, but ultimately only carbon removals count towards net zero. So if you were to balance 100% of your emissions with avoidance offsets, as shown by the gray area, so say renewable energy projects or clean cook stoves, those kind of things, you'll be carbon neutral, which is brilliant, but it is not the same thing as net zero. Okay, I hope you're not completely overwhelmed. The good news is that for everything I just went through, TechZero and other UN RaceToZero organizations exist to help. So with that, maybe hand back over to Hadar, and then after the break, I might hear from you potentially, and then we can hear from some TechZero members to see how they've reduced their emissions.
Yeah, maybe we'll have some questions, if someone has any questions.
Yeah.
What you just discussed.
Yeah, actually, I have a quick question. So with tech companies, with startups, there's companies that today are with 100 employees, and in 5 years they will have 1,000 employees.
Yes.
And the calculations that they will make today will not be relevant for 5 years, unlike corporates that are not growing in this, size. How do you address this? Because in the end, we're speaking about a total amount, tons of CO2, which is not by, how can they address it according to their growth? Because these companies are growing, unlike, corporates that are not growing in the same pace.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a brilliant question. And I'm sure that some of our members, I know we've got Ben Knight from GoCardless who will be able to attest to that, James from MSQ. We have recently published a little guide on this because, yeah, a lot of the companies we work with are startups and they are planning to grow exponentially. So one thing that we say to do is kind of plan ahead where you think you might be. I mean, and set targets at the same time as your financial targets. So you know you're going to grow. So project yourself into the future and also measure the carbon for how many offices you think you'd have, how many employees you'd have, and then try and, again, identify what areas of your growing business are more likely to mean that your emissions will grow as well, and see how you can put policies in place to make sure they don't grow at the same rate as your business and your team. And another way to do it is, rather than focusing on absolute emissions, so say 100 tons of CO2, you focus on your, my brain's...
Intensity-based, Sophia, is the word you're looking for.
Sorry?
It's intensity-based emissions.
Yes,
I think is the word.
That's it. Too early in the morning here.
That's okay.
Intensity-based targets. So that is where you divide your absolute emissions by another business metric, say your revenue or the number of employees you have, so by head count. And so say MSQ's intensity ratio is 5 tons of CO2 per employee. That might be ridiculous, but 5 tons of CO2 per employee. You're making sure that there are policies in place that mean that won't grow. So even if you have 1,000 employees, it either stays at 5 per employee or ideally reduces. James, did you want to talk about?
Yeah, because it's a really good point. I mean, you're absolutely right in that it's absolutely right to measure your intensity based, right? So if you're growing by 10-fold and you're halving your emissions in absolute terms might go up. Now, it's also fair to say that, in my opinion, the Science-Based Target Initiative, so the place where we formally commit these net zero targets, hasn't really figured this out yet properly for fast growing startups. It's true that we have to have a reduction in absolute terms, You know, climate change doesn't play nicely with economic growth. You know, it doesn't matter. You know, if you're Apple and you halve your emissions, but you sell 10 times more devices, you know, that's no good. That doesn't work. But you're right. It's very different for a startup today, because if you're going to submit a formal net zero target, you do have to show that it is a 90% reduction in absolute terms. Now, if you're a 10-person startup today and you're going to be 1,000 people, it's ridiculous, really. And in fact, you're right, the SBTI doesn't kind of really work. But I think we have to take a more pragmatic view. I think there will be more guidance coming for professional service businesses, how you factor that in on, especially if it's on a per head basis, because it's a, you know, a zero-sum game in terms of population growth. It's a very astute question, and I'm not giving you a super clear answer. There are certainly ways you can measure it. It's absolutely fine to divide your emissions by head count or by revenue, as Sophia says, but it does actually make it difficult for you to set an official net zero target at the moment. But I think we'll see that change.
And I think that's also where updating those targets comes in. So every 5 years you get to review, or less than 5 years you get to review. Yeah, so yeah, thanks, James.
Thank you.
I have another question. How do you take into account in the matters the actual product that, especially us as companies that work on removing, for example, remove cows from the ecosystem, or us where we produce alternative protein to replace the need for beef or for soy, for anything else from microalgae, that doesn't go into account in the calculations, or we actually remove very polluting, very high emissions from the environment, replacing it with a more sustainable source, and eventually calculating how much our offices and cars emit is negligible compared to the effect we have on the environment. And so I feel like calculating these kinds of numbers doesn't really show the true picture of what startups like us do to net zero eventually.
That's also a really great point. And I completely hear what you're saying. And I think part of that is, it is just good. So on one hand, you are just looking at your business and what your business does in kind of isolation to the good, as you said, the good things that you result in. But I think it's, first of all, just good to get a handle on your emissions as a company, just to make sure they don't increase, because that is very important for, you know, reaching a whole net zero world and economy. But then that's not to say that when you do all those things, you just have to leave out everything good you've done. So in those reports, it is really great to include all that, say that, you know, this is our footprint, but really it is negligible because we have led to a reduction of emissions in this part of the world. So that's not to say that you need to leave them out of what you're reporting and what you're doing, but it is just a kind of exercise in making sure that your business itself is also as sustainable as possible.
Sophia, can I?
Sorry?
Yeah, sorry, can I just clarify we understand what you're saying? Are you saying then that when you're doing the data gathering that you spoke about, the collection exercise, and you also kind of had a icon talking about your customers, that basically if you can come up with a calculation that say if you're selling protein, sustainable protein, and you basically can come up with a data calculation which estimates how much protein that replaces that was from a non-carbon kind of friendly source.
So I'd say
that's something you can include in your stats.
Yes, but then, so there's either that way to do it, or just as a kind of separate thing that you can put in the report is, say, if our technology didn't exist and it was done this way, this is how much CO2 could be released into the atmosphere, and this is how much we've saved by allowing members or customers to use our product.
Yeah, I agree. I think, to be really clear, sorry, Sophia, it is a separate thing. So in other words, let me give another example. Tesla, who actually don't have great sustainability scores, right? They have very bad mining operations, quite a high carbon footprint. They cannot say for every Tesla that we sell, that reduces emissions by 2.5 tons a year, because that's the average that a diesel car would kick out. So you can't sort of report negative emissions just because your product sort of does something good and offsets that. You would have to report on the emissions of your operations. So you obviously have to manufacture this stuff, you have staff, you have emissions, but absolutely you should be shouting from the treetops in the same reports as Sophia is saying, is like, look at the impact that we're having, as Tesla could do. Look at the impact of all these electric vehicles, but you can't sort of report negative emissions in that way. It's similar for us. We build very large digital platforms, and I talk a lot about the digital footprints. The internet has a larger carbon footprint than the airline industry, and we work very hard to reduce the digital emissions of our very large clients, and that has a very big impact, that work that we do. We shout about that and we talk about that and we tell our customers about it, but we can't factor that in. It doesn't counterbalance our own emissions, rightly or wrongly, but that those are the rules at the moment, I think, just to be clear.
Yeah, because what we don't want to happen is for the kind of Jevons paradox to happen, where some companies go, you know what, we're saving all the CO2 over here, so we can kind of ramp up our emissions because it kind of balances out. That's something we want to avoid.
Let me just make a comment. I think if I recall, the GHG protocol at one time proposed a scope 4 category, which actually relates to these avoided emissions, because it's not part of the footprint, but because you want to scream it out at the treetops, then a proposition of a scope 4, which can relate to those avoided emissions.
Yes, I think it's important because, again, also us, and I can also speak, I think, for women, the more emissions we put into the atmosphere, it's actually better, because we're removing emissions from different industries. I mean, the more fermenters we have, the larger their production is, and the more alternative protein we produce, our emissions will be very high, but it will remove like 90% of the emissions that beef produce if we weren't there. And just start, I mean, if we provide these numbers, and then say, well, these are the numbers, we actually increased our emissions 10-fold, 1,000-fold, but don't worry, because actually we're removing alternative protein, we're removing the existing protein from the market. I mean, it's a bias. I mean, because the numbers people will see if we use the calculator will show that our emissions actually increased dramatically. But this is a wrong way to look at the picture.
And I think the answer to that is we should be putting pressure on the SBTi to adopt things like that scope 4 thing, which I haven't heard about. But it's exactly the same for these carbon capture companies, right? Direct air capture is very, very energy intensive, and you need to run it from renewable energy and things like that. But we need them to scale. Those processes, will have emissions. So I think you're right. I think at the moment the official mechanisms need another layer on it for tech companies like yourselves, because of course they're not aimed at that. They're aimed at the big traditional legacy businesses. And so at the moment, I wouldn't worry about it too much. I think it's amazing. Like, fingers crossed your company grows and we see your emissions grow. That's a brilliant thing for the planet, and we of course need to see the official guidance change so that you don't have to explain that. But that, that's where it is at the moment, in my understanding at least.
I think that it is solved as long as more companies will join the race to zero emission. Let's say a dairy producer, and he will start using your technology, he will reduce his emissions. So it's just who along the supply chain is going to enjoy the saving, and you are selling him the tool. So you are valued already as a scope 4, what you've called, by definition, something that is generating a reduction of, so somebody that is really going to go to RaceToZero and can be a client of your technology, right, should pay for what he's paying is already included in the package for the products you are giving for his supply chain, as well as the carbon reduction. I mean, it cannot be it's a one bill, but it includes his your functional functional price and carbon reduction. So I think it's already in your model from more demand that will come from companies that would like to replace their existing sources with alternative, more sustainable sources as you are making.
No, this is absolutely correct. I mean, like these large food companies are just under the pressure to change their supply and find alternatives, and they're doing exactly what you're saying.
You're their scope 3. You're
Yeah,
the
we are
90%.
the scope 3, and
they will enjoy it, and they have to pay. That's why they will pay, I guess, a bit more for now for this type of alternative proteins, because it's worth them in the calculation for what they are receiving in their goals to become net zero.
In general, all the system is a recursive system, because it depends on your supply chain, and the scope 3 is forcing, like if it's the big companies are forcing the smaller suppliers all the way, yeah, but not just in this industry.
I'm going to give you 5 minutes, maybe a short break for coffee,
Yeah.
And then we can jump into the second part when you can hear more from James and Ben and Sally on their journeys for RaceToZero. Okay, 5 minutes. Yeah, we'll be back.
I do, but yes. Yeah, that was before my time around. Thanks for having me.
Okay, hi guys, I'm herding everyone back in. Apologies for the slight delay and thank you for hanging in there. where we just went for a quick coffee and some nibbles.
מי הדובר הבא?
כל ארבעתם.
כולם?
בינתיים. יש כמה מורים.
מאוד מעניין, אני ממש בתוך זה, כאילו בימים האלה לגמרי, בתוכן הזה של המדידות, בדיוק השאלה רגע, מי מגיע לקרדיט, אתה עושים אופסטים, כי אני רואה כמה סטארט-אפים מתעסקים בזה,
זהו,
צריך להבין לאן זה הולך.
זה תעשייה עכשיו של ספינינג.
לגמרי.
יש ממש תחושה כזאת של...
גם כל היצירת מידע בתוכה גם מאוד מאוד חשוב, כי כל השאלות האלה, רגע, מי נהנה למה ואיך הוא מקבל את האופסטים, זה עצום, כאילו, חלק שלה, אחד עדיין מזהם גם אם הוא משתפר, אחר עושה הפחתה בהערות או דברים, ויש איזשהו עולם של...
שווה שתדבר עם אבי מנוח קפיטל, פה, אבל אחר כך, אני רוצה שתתכנסו, הוא מוביל, הוא בחברת מ-VC גם, מאבנון, כאילו לא מ-VC, מ-Investment Group, אבי,
בקיצור,
תתחבר לג'ק, אני אראה כמה...
כן, אני אומר רק היה לנו קצת מוקדם, אני ממש הייתי
נכון.
מי הקופון?
היי?
איך היה בחו"ל?
עברת לקפיטל שם?
למה הם בחו"ל?
אני בקרן של נורס קפיטל, זה קרן חדשה שהקמנו לאחרונה.
הוא עדיין לא שם
לעשות לפני
אבל מעניין
היה עכשיו בקפיטל שהקמנו קרן. זה השקעות בפלנטק,
אובר משתמשים
יש לך כרטיס, לינקדאין, יש לך דניאל, תכניס לך ללינקדאין, אבל זה טוב, אנחנו לא יודעים
Okay, Sophia, I think we can start.
Now, because it sounds like there's amazing questions coming from the room and potential for a lot of discussion, so I think I might jump straight to them to some of our TechZero members that we have here today. So we've got James Cunnings from MSQ that you've heard from a little bit already, Ben Knight from GoCardless, and Sally Scott from Metrikus. And I'll just invite them to give them their stories, their experience of being part of both TechZero and the UN RaceToZero, and how their businesses have kind of incorporated all of the commitments. So James, did you want to kick us off?
Yep, thanks, Sophia. Yep, hi everyone. Great to see you. It's lovely to listen to the discussion. I'll keep this quite short because I think the questions from you guys are perhaps kind of more interesting. But yeah, I'm James. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer at MSQ. We're a global digital marketing and technology group, about 1,000 people, about half of that in the UK, but also based out of the US, China, and Singapore. I accidentally became an expert in environmental sustainability after I took my own business carbon negative back in 2018, which is really just an extension of what Sophia was talking about. It just means we used a lot more avoidance offsetting because it's quite cheap than our emissions to be carbon negative, which was a good first step. We were then acquired by MSQ, or my business was, and we rolled out all of the processes that I developed for measurement, similar to Ben with his calculator. I developed my own. The tools were still not great. They're getting better, but in 2018 they were particularly non-existent, really, for small businesses anyway. And so across MSQ, we then set our reduction strategies in the short term, but we also now have what's called near-term science-based targets. That's that 2030 halving of emissions. And this year we will have a formal net zero pledge for 2040 with the SBTi. We've seen massive benefits at MSQ of behaving like this. I work directly with the board. This is a very big initiative. It's critical for attracting and retaining staff, not just because of the way we behave as an organization, which they really appreciate, but we have a wide range of staff schemes, electric vehicle lease hire schemes, electric bike lease hire schemes for the cities. We have renewable energy schemes for our staff to discount that. We have a staff offsetting and tree planting scheme that we contribute to, with more getting added to all the time. And then it has benefits with our clients. More and more as we're working for larger and larger clients, they require us to have science-based targets in order to come and work for them because we're part of their scope 3. So it becomes difficult to get work with large clients if you don't operate like this, more and more in the UK and certainly in the public sector at the moment. But equally, and I touched on digital footprints briefly, but also trying to look at our proposition to our clients. How can we position MSQ as global leaders in environmentally sustainable digital marketing? Now, if all that sounds interesting and potentially overwhelming in terms of how you get started, and Sophia kind of gave you a whistle-stop tour of lots of things. One of the things that was very important to me was to open source everything that I do, and maybe this is something we could share afterwards as well. I developed and launched last year a course on the FutureLearn e-learning platform, very simple for SMEs, called How to Measure, Reduce and Offset Your Company Carbon Footprint. It talks through all the definitions, the terminology. We step through some different measurement tools, link to others. We learn about offsetting and permanent carbon capture, etc., etc. And we've got over 1,000 people enrolled on that course already, and it's going down really well. So that's a nice resource. Now, I joined TechZero initially because I felt I might be able to help others, and that was certainly the case. And I think we're going to hear from Sally. It was great. She was one of the people that went on the course, and that was great. Actually, I made some connections and it helped me learn a lot. I met Ben, who's going to talk, and he shared some of his data from his calculator, which helped improve mine, and that'll go up on the course and improve that for everybody else. And I also met some people from the Carbon Removal Centre, and I've started to learn more about permanent carbon capture, which Sophia talked about a little bit. And we're going to be using permanent carbon capture, that carbon removal, for our scope 1 emissions this year. We're going to front load that because it's a great thing to do. It's a great thing to support those sorts of projects. So yeah, I definitely really valued that community and learned a lot. I was asked to finish with sort of one tip where I could start, and the thing that springs to mind is that education piece. Educate yourself and your businesses on these definitions. What is scope 1, 2 and 3? What is the difference between carbon neutrality and net zero, which requires you to understand the difference between offsetting and permanent carbon capture? And then again, as Sophia says, even a very crude effort at measuring, and there are some tools on my course, or the tools that Ben's built, to get you started really quickly if you're a small business, in just a few hours almost, because it'll mean that you focus in the right area and you don't just focus on your electricity usage, which is often just really 5% of your emissions. It's really not a big deal. So it's education and measurement. And yeah, that was it from me. I think I'll maybe pass over to Ben. Should we rattle through and then do questions at the end? Does that make sense?
Yeah, we can go to Ben.
Or was it Sally? Sorry, have I hijacked the order?
Oh, it doesn't really matter at this point. Yeah, take it away, one of you, someone.
After you, Sally.
Okay, I'll go. And it follows on quite nicely from James's. And I'll just share. I'm just going to share a couple of slides. If I can, let's see. If not, I'll just talk through. Okay, that one should be right. can you see the slides now, or is that the text? The choice of Zoom, hey. Here we go. Okay, nice. Let me move that. Oh, slideshow, then you can see. Okay, so I'll just give you a quick intro to Metrikus. Can everyone see that now? Yeah. Okay, great. So just to give you a bit of background, so we're a fairly small company still, scaling up pretty quickly. That's why I've put 30 to 40, because we're kind of growing week on week at the moment, which has its own challenges. But we're basically a software that helps to make the built environment more sustainable, essentially. But we're kind of pivoting more towards that off the back of this sustainability journey that we've been on, which is quite interesting, because initially we were more focused on kind of intelligent workspace. I'm not sure how much you guys know about that, but it's essentially making buildings, using data to make buildings more efficient. And in terms of global presence, we're UK based, London head office, but we have people working out of Spain and India, and we're moving over to the US this year. So just to then move on to our sustainability journey, so far, what's quite interesting for us, and from what you guys have said in the room so far, is around that kind of the balance between your company kind of having a positive impact, but then how do you measure your own internal impact as well? So that's kind of the journey we've been on, and part of the reason that we then joined TechZero, because we were starting to get questions from our customers and from our partners who we work with about kind of what we were doing and how we were measuring our own impact. And as a small company, we don't necessarily have the resource or the money to hire an external consultant. So we thought if we joined TechZero, we'd heard that it was quite, and as you've heard from James, there's quite a community and there's resources available. So yeah, we joined TechZero and decided to position net zero as more of a centerpiece of our company, as well as it kind of being part of our business strategy, start to look internally as well. And off the back of that, as for me, my role isn't necessarily, I think the others are kind of a head of sustainability type role. My role is actually product and partner manager. But we started this sustainability committee where we have people across different teams, and we all work together to, and we've done that education piece that James talked about, and used his course. So that's been an amazing resource for us, because we were kind of looking online for different calculators. A lot of them you have to either pay for, or you might need a consultant to do data analysis on, but James's is super accessible. So it's allowed us to then do the step 3 that you can see on here. So measuring our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And because it's expense-based, the calculator, we had to do kind of internal data collection that Sophia mentioned earlier. So we've kind of been working with our finance team and had to do some internal questionnaires to try and find out more about our workforce's kind of habits, both at home and traveling to and from the office. But we've now got to the point where we've been able to, carry out that analysis on it and look at the hotspots and start to put together a strategy as part of our first sustainability report. I think Sophia mentioned as well Supercritical, who are also part of TechZero. So we've used their report as an example of where we'd like to get to. For us, it's kind of an achievable target. We haven't got necessarily heaps of money to throw at this at the moment, but we're trying to, as the guys have mentioned, trying to make the first steps towards having a picture of where the highest emissions are for us as a company. And because we sell hardware and stuff, it's been difficult, but we've got to the point where we're starting to identify where we could be reducing and offsetting. I actually attended Ben's workshop as well. That was the climate action workshop that gave us other tips for ways we could start to reduce the footprint of our software as a platform. So how could we reduce the footprint of our platform as well? So yeah, we're starting to get to the next stage of actually kind of taking action and setting ourselves targets. And then we'll begin to look at kind of the SBTIs that James mentioned, and setting more official targets, I guess, once we've got this big picture for ourselves, that we'll be able to report to our kind of board members and externally to customers. And just I added on this sixth point as kind of the added benefit, because I think I mentioned before that our platform kind of is kind of sustainability focused, but it wasn't really before. And we're trying to, throughout this journey, we've been able to kind of realize how actually we could be leveraging the data that we collect on our platform to help people reduce the energy consumption within their built environment. I think it was touched on in one of the first talks we had this morning around the built environment being such a massive player in carbon emissions. I think it's actually about 40% of global emissions are attributed to the built environment. So we're, as part of this kind of refocusing us internally as a business to look at ourselves, we're also looking at how we can then support other companies to reduce the impact of their built environment. So it's kind of been there's been a couple of different benefits to starting this journey that we wouldn't necessarily have thought of. But yeah, it's been very interesting, a massive learning curve. And I think in terms of kind of the final point and the final piece of advice is, and I think I've said it before, Sophia, to you, just around the kind of getting started. And it can seem quite daunting. I think for us as sort of a startup sized company with no committed resource, it was quite daunting, all the different language and the different terminology. But we've had the community as part of TechZero to help us keep learning and start to get us on our way. And we've got kind of that rough idea now. And as the quote that we saw before, we'll keep iterating on that. But yeah, I think it's kind of just the getting started can seem quite daunting, but yeah, it's been good for us. So yeah, that's all from me.
Thanks, Sally. And I will just say as well that I've put together a whole list of resources that Sammy will share afterwards, and that would include James's Future Learn course, TechZero Toolkit, some other things that you can use that will help that all of these members have used. So with that, Ben, over to you.
Great stuff. Thank you. Thanks, Sally, and thanks, James. And good morning, everyone. It's lovely to join you all. My 1-year-old's been up since 5 o'clock UK time, so I'm on about my 5th coffee already. So I need to slow down a little bit, but I'm going to try and do a technical thing and share my screen. So hopefully you can see some slides now. Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
So I'm Ben. I'm head of sustainability here at GoCardless. Just give you a very quick overview. So we are a global fintech, a payment platform. Essentially what we do is we move money from A to B for our customers. So we're based in the UK, but we have offices in the US, France, Australia, and Germany. And we process transactions for around 70,000 customers at the moment. And we move around $20 billion a year. I guess in terms of the story and the speed of our scale up. So back in 2019, we had 342 employees. At the moment, we are actually, it's more than that now. It's just over 800. And potentially by the mid 2030s, we're going to be up to, potentially 10 times that. So we are a rapidly scaling up company. And you might have seen in the news recently, last few days, we announced we've just become a tech unicorn, which is fantastic. So I guess our mission is taking the pain out of getting paid for our customers, which is really important for their economic sustainability. If they have cash flow, then they can actually concentrate on what they're doing. But then it's also really important that we consider environmental and social sustainability in the same context. So as part of that, we became TechZero co-founders back in April or May last year, I think. So just before I joined, but previously to joining GoCardless, I actually worked in the space sector. So I was looking at measuring emissions in rockets and satellites and things like that. So I've moved from almost completely physical stuff to almost completely digital things, which has been a really exciting experience so far. But I think the really key thing for us was straight away splitting our sustainability focus into 2 really clear, distinct pillars. And it's kind of similar to what has been mentioned already, the idea of reducing our own impact as a business. So looking at our impact on climate, so our emissions, other areas as well, but specifically looking at that straight away. But then in the longer term, how can we create positive change through what we're doing? So how can we work with our customers to help them become more sustainable? Or how can we use our platform to create positive change on biodiversity or communities or that sort of thing? So a really clear two-pillar approach straight away. We set out measuring our own emissions, which is similar to James. We used our own in-house calculators to measure our emissions across scope 1, 2, and 3. And I'll get on to the sort of next steps on that. But I thought really importantly, so for us at GoCardless, our main, one of our main ethos is starting with why. And I know we've already spoke about the why from the business context, but I think from on the global context, I think is also really important. The definition of sustainability, or to be sustainable, is to continue to exist. And obviously, whether you're a business or you're just a person, that's really quite an important aim, I think. So, but I think in the context globally at the moment, humanity consumes 1.75 Earths to provide our natural resources and also absorb our waste, which includes our greenhouse gas emissions, which is clearly not sustainable. We don't have 1.75. We've got one Earth where we all live, and we're all interconnected as humans, as societies, and as economies, and we're all dependent upon the natural world around us. So in that global context, it's really important that we reduce our impact and create positive change. But then also on that, the business side of things, I know we've mentioned about the investment. I think one of our new investors was actually BlackRock, who specifically look into ESG sustainability criteria when they're investing. I think the talent side of things is massively important. Our employee base is really engaged with what we're doing on sustainability. So not just climate, but also areas like diversity and inclusion and well-being and things like that. But I think also on the customer side of things, we're increasingly seeing, like James mentioned, a lot of our customers asking us what we're doing on sustainability, but also we're getting approached by companies who are coming directly to us now because of what we're doing on sustainability. And that's really even before we start shouting about it through marketing and things like that. I think also on the personal level, I think if you care about your customers or your employees or even your shareholders or your investors, or as a human, if you care about your neighbors and your family, your friends, if you don't take action on climate, then you're not contributing to well-being, you're contributing to harm. So I think that's the really clear way that I like to think about it a lot of the time. So essentially that's the why, both the global context and the business context. But I think also really importantly for us as a scale-up, what we've started to look at is what happens if we don't take action. So yes, we've got the point that we are going to look outside of ourselves to try and create positive change. Even by the nature of people, our name is GoCardless, right? So if you use us over direct debit or credit cards, they produce something like 522 million tons of CO2 each year. But it's also really important that we reduce our own emissions. So this chart just demonstrates what our emissions over time with our increased headcount would be. And essentially by 2035, we'll be at 1 million tons of cumulative emissions, which is roughly the same as what a small country puts out in 1 year. So even though at the moment we're a relatively small business, it's really important that as we grow, we're decoupling our emissions from our growth. So that's just for some context of the why on our level. So what we're going to do to get there. So similarly to what James and Sally mentioned, we're aligning ourselves with the science-based targets. And what we're mapping at the moment and what we're planning for is essentially a short-term target of 2027. So over the next 5 years, really focusing on decarbonising wherever we can in those areas that we can take action. Obviously, certain things we can't yet because we have to wait for the wider economy to get there. But then looking at a long-term target of 2035. Now, we're still working through the numbers. Obviously, the science-based target standard only really came out not too long ago. But I guess the key thing on this is, for us, is the 2027, what we're going to do in that short term. Because then if we decarbonise now, as we scale up, then that helps us in the longer term. And the specific areas that we're looking at this, when I try and communicate this with my colleagues and we start talking about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, a lot of time I see them glaze over completely. So we've kind of split this into key pillars or buckets, as you can see here, which essentially collaborating with our supply chain, our employees, and our customers. That's a really easy way that we see this working. And for our side, it's really important that these three groups are themselves sustainable, because if we don't have a sustainable supply chain, we won't be able to create our product. If we don't have sustainable employees, we won't have anyone creating the product. And obviously, if we don't have sustainable customers, if our customers don't exist in 10 years' time, we won't have any revenue. So it's really important that we collaborate across those pillars to help everyone transition to a net zero sustainable economy. But specifically, that means on our supply chain, looking at our purchase goods and services. So every company that we work with on our supply chain has an impact, whether positively or negatively, on our own emissions. But it's also making sure that we're not making demands on some of those companies. I think in the UK, 90% of SMEs don't measure their emissions at the moment. So it would just be really mean for us to say, hey guys, we're not going to use you if you're not doing anything. So that's why I think, James, you mentioned the idea of making sustainability open source. And I love the phrase democratizing sustainability. So basically giving tools and resources and helping people, which is what TechZero is about, really. But really importantly for us as well is working with our employees, both on internal engagement. So we've run workshops, we've got volunteer groups, but also looking at the impact of travel, whether that's commuting to work or travel between offices, home working, because in the UK, most people have got gas boilers, which is massively impactful on our home working. So looking at how can we help our employees decarbonize their home working, and also on the customer side, because how our customers use our product has an impact on our own emissions, because they have to use energy to access our services. There's other areas outside of that, the scope 1 type things, energy in offices, waste, investments, HVAC in offices, that sort of thing. But for us, that's quite small now. 99.8% of our emissions are what sit within the scope 3. And I think, looping back to the point earlier about the emissions that sit outside of the idea of scope 4. So yes, I guess by people not using plastic credit cards, for example, we could say that we can communicate that we're helping to save those 522 million tons. But also on the flip side, we're facilitating people's purchases. So if we look at our 70,000 customers, what they're selling, the potential emissions from that at the moment could be far greater than that 522 million tons. So it's communicating that both in the positive sense and the negative sense, and then working across all those groups to try and bring about positive change. And just the last thing, because Sophia knows that I bang on about this all the time, but it's really important for us that it's not just all about carbon. We have to make sure that we're considering biodiversity, the natural world, and communities in our transition to sustainability, because we are all interlinked. And ordinarily I have a video with elephants and dinosaurs and stuff, but I'm just conscious of time and that I want to get on to, we can get on to some questions. So that's all from my slides. I will hand back to Sophia.
Thanks, Ben. Did you have one tip for those who might be considering embarking on UN RaceToZero journey?
I would say just go for it, get started. That first step is probably the most important one, and sign up to TechZero or an equivalent group, because I think the collaboration part is so key. No one business, no one person, no one country can get to net zero or a sustainable economy by themselves. It's all about collaboration. And yeah, as James mentioned, as TechZero, but always constantly, I can see actually my WhatsApp chat going off on my phone with people asking questions about supply chains this morning. So collaborate and get started, which I know is kind of two things, but yeah.
Thank you. Okay, I'm conscious of time, but Hadar, do we have time for questions?
Yeah, if anyone here has something to ask one of our guests, this is the time.
So I'll ask something quickly. Did you see any impact on the investors of yours when you declared or spoke about joining RaceToZero or TechZero? Was this significant for your investors in any way, or only for service investors? I mean, that would be interesting as a motivation maybe for why joining this initiative.
I mean, from my point of view, MSQ is backed by LDC, so we're owned by Lloyd's Development Capital. That's the private equity arm of Lloyd's, and I can only say they have been just hugely supportive of the environmental work. We're also going through the B Corp process, if you've come across that, which is a qualification across sustainability more broadly. Tech businesses are usually people, we're all people businesses, right? We have to get the best talent, and there's so much data out there. It was mentioned at the start, about these correlations between businesses investing in sustainability more broadly and those that are growing fast. So I'm perhaps cynical about their reasons for being positive about it, that they see us doing this as a key part of being a successful growing business, and a big risk if we're not seen to be doing it. If we're cutting corners and saving money down the line, we're just going to struggle to hire talent, and we're going to struggle to sell our products and services. So our investors were, really, really behind this.
I think so we've obviously just recently raised an additional $312 million, I think, if I remember the press release correctly. But I think there was certainly specific questions on ESG that came in from both of the lead investors and the other investors as well. And I guess that's probably going to continue. But I know that our main investor is really engaged with our CFO, who's our exec lead on sustainability, and they've got really good ideas and views which really align with what we want to achieve in terms of us becoming and being able to say that we're a sustainable tech business, because obviously we need to do a lot of work before then to be able to honestly say that we are a sustainable business. But I think there's definitely that alignment between our investors and then what we're doing, which is great to see. And I think that's probably only going to increase, because I think in the wider context of things like net zero transition risk and TCFD reporting and things like that, and ESG, it's become such a growing trend that it's only going to increase.
So I think we're finished. I just want to really thank you, our UK guests, for waking up really, really early and logging into Zoom and staying perky. I just want to say that until an Israeli parallel to TechZero will be established here, TechZero also has subsidiaries in different countries around the world, and maybe we'll bring an open an Israeli subsidiary for TechZero here in Israel. As far as I'm concerned, Israeli companies can reach out to TechZero and join their community. So I will distribute the contact details, and I'm encouraging you to get in touch with them and start your journey. And on that note, I'd like to thank you as well for coming here today. Thank God it's not raining right now, but I thought no one would come. It was really raining in Rehovot. So thank you very much, and I hope you stay in touch.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Good luck.
Thank you so much.
מה שהם יותר רציניים מאיתנו
אני יצא לי, אחרי שהגעתי לפלנטק, למדתי שנתיים איזושהי הרצאה דרך איזשהו ארגון, הסקופ 3. לפני בערך שנה וחצי. המושג לא היה מוכר, המושג והכל השתנה. זאת אומרת, זה נכון, אנחנו עוד לא עושים, עוד לא מדדים, עוד לא מפתחים, אבל המודעות היא שאתה אנשים מודעים. I'm not unique. I'm a section.